Can you hear us?
Are you talking to me?
Yeah, I'm trying. You can
Podemos
hear.
iniciar, Vitor.
Ok, ele disse que não está me ouvindo aí, mas eu acho que é porque a tradução tem aqui.
But you don't hear this strange noises.
Yeah, I hear as well. I hear
As well. We
Yeah.
cannot do anything.
Yeah. Tem que ter um barulho estranho aí, Gabi. Tem que ter um barulho estranho aí, Gabi.
A gente está tentando ajustar. De toda forma, já deu início. As pessoas já estão nos assistindo. Acredito que seja do lado do professor Teubner.
Try.
Bom.
Pode dar início, Vitor.
Bom dia a todos. Estamos iniciando mais um encontro do Grupo de Estudos Perspectivas Contemporâneas da Jurisdição Constitucional, ao vivo, através do nosso canal do IDP no YouTube. E hoje teremos a honrosa e ilustre participação do sociólogo e jurista alemão Gunther Teubner. Irei passar a palavra ao ministro professor Gilmar Mendes, que irá fazer a apresentação do nosso convidado, e em seguida partiremos já diretamente para a intervenção dele.
Bom dia a todos, cumprimentar o professor Gunther Teubner e cumprimentar a todos os participantes deste evento. Eu vou fazer uma breve apresentação. O sociólogo e jurista alemão Gunther Teubner é professor catedrático de Direito Privado e de Sociologia do Direito da Goethe Universität Frankfurt am Main, é Centennial Professor da London School of Economics and Political Science e do Instituto Europeu de Florença, além de ser membro das principais academias de ciências do mundo. É um dos mais renomados juristas da contemporaneidade, reconhecido internacionalmente por suas contribuições acadêmicas inovadoras no campo da Social Theory of Law. O traço distintivo do legado acadêmico de Teubner reside na exploração do processo de diferenciação da sociedade moderna, correlata a uma fragmentação da possibilidade de uma referência central resulta em uma concepção singular de um direito reflexivo, enquanto sistema que se situa para além do positivismo e de desenvolvimentos meramente materialistas. Nos últimos anos, o professor Gunther Teubner tem direcionado sua produção acadêmica à compreensão da formação de constituições societais, a partir de processos transnacionais de produção do direito e as repercussões desse fenômeno. No Brasil, a obra de Teubner passou a ter reconhecida distinção no final da década de 1980, com a publicação da obra O Direito como Sistema Autopoético. Os laços do professor Gunther Teubner com a comunidade acadêmica nacional são constantemente fortalecidos com a revisitação de suas obras pelos nossos juristas, sociólogos e cientistas políticos. Em sua última visita ao Brasil, em 2016, o Instituto Brasilense de Direito Público concedeu ao professor Teubner o título de doutor honoris causa, constitucionalismo social na globalização, que acaba de ter a sua segunda edição lançada no Brasil, mais uma vez pelo selo IDP Saraiva. Na manhã de hoje, dando continuidade aos trabalhos do Grupo de Estudo Perspectivas Contemporâneas da Jurisdição Constitucional, teremos a rica oportunidade de ouvir o professor Gunther Teubner, que discutirá aspectos de um texto recentemente publicado no Verfassungsblog, na Alemanha, que aborda como o imperativo de criação de mais-valia pode atuar como uma função de diversos sistemas sociais autopoéticos e não um mero produto exclusivo das forças econômicas. Ao final da intervenção, teremos a oportunidade de debater e endereçar perguntas ao nosso ilustre convidado. Seja bem-vindo, professor Gunther Teubner, entre nós.
Yes, thank you. Good morning to everybody. I would like to thank you, my friend and colleague, Judge Gilmar Mendes, for the friendly invitation to have the opportunity with a discussion with Brazilian scholars. It's not the first time that I have been to Brazil. I've been there several times, and I really enjoyed the beauty of the landscape, the beauty of the people, the women, and I enjoyed the vivid and passionate intellectual climate which is there. And I think this is quite unique in Brasilia. If I compare to the Anglo-American culture, I think in Brazil there is a much higher sensitivity toward European theory, toward Michel Foucault or Niklas Luhmann. And I think what we could do today is to create a surplus of social and legal theory. And here is already my theme, the surplus. What I'm talking about is the constitution of non-monetary surplus values. The constitution, I say, because the law plays an important role in this whole process. I will begin with a very famous quotation. The production of surplus value or the making of profits is the absolute law of the capitalist mode of production. Of course, you know who is the writer of these lines. It is Karl Marx. And I will develop an argument against Marx, with Marx, and beyond Marx. I will talk about that the production of surplus value is no longer restricted to the economy, as it is with profit, but applies to law and to other areas of society as well. And it is in this specific sense that capitalist societies are surplus-driven societies, in a more universal and a more particularistic sense than in the traditional critique of capitalism. The orthodox Marxist critique of value claims to capture the totality of modern society. But this is a mistaken totalization of economic value and monetary profit. It ignores the development of social theory after Karl Marx, from Max Weber to Pierre Bourdieu. A whole series of Karl Marx receptions has sought analogy to the capitalist logic of the economy in law and in other areas of society. Max Weber, with his influential metaphor of a new polytheism, so a new multiplicity of gods, as opposed to the old Greek polytheism, he demonstrated successfully that modernity owes its characteristics not only to the formal rationality of the capitalist economy, but equally to a whole variety of constructed formal rationalities, including the formal rationality of law. Otto Kirchheimer picked up on this and described an autonomization of the machinery of law, while at the same time, with his concept of juridification, he detailed its problematic society-wide expansion parallel to the economization of the world. Pashukanis conceived the legal form in analogy to Marx's commodity form with all its alienation phenomena. And with the construct of social capital, Pierre Bourdieu generalized Marx's concept of capital in order to apply it analogously as a resource of the actors competing for power in various social fields. I suggest to identify equivalence to the driving force of capitalism in other areas of society. I suggest the analogy to avaricia. Is this also Brazilian? Avaricia, avarice, greed, the worst of all medieval deadly sins, equivalence to the economic profit principle itself. So the critique of capitalism would change. It would no longer be solely directed at surplus value completion within the economy, nor would it only challenge the increasing economization of social worlds, that is, the expansion of the economy pushed by neoliberal fanatics of the economic profit principle into non-economic areas of society. No, I try something different, a different kind of society expansion of the capitalistic logic. And my thesis is, apart from economic profit, a multiplicity of non-monetary surplus value pressures are responsible for capitalism's productive dynamics, in particularly for its destructive effects. I will develop 6 arguments in order to support this thesis. Argument number 1, generalization and respecification of surplus value. Not only the economy, but also other functional systems force each of their operations to generate a specific surplus value, but now explicitly non-monetary, beyond its immediate production of meaning. The method for this argument is the generalization of the profit motive away from the economy to all social systems and its respecification toward each of the different social systems. So this needs to be done in regard to the category of profit or surplus value to allow the identification of different types of surplus value. In politics, non-monetary surplus value means that each policy decision needs to generate simultaneously a surplus of political power for future use. In science, successful research in the various subject areas, which is officially oriented toward the production of knowledge, is unofficially but effectively oriented toward what? Maximizing reputation. In education, besides the specific skills of the person to be educated, a surplus of the medium of education, that is the success in educational selection, exams, grades, and so on, needs always to be produced in the form of institutionalized proofs of qualification. And in law, the courts are under the pressure to create a normative surplus value, that is, a specific persuasive authority that can be generalized for the future, over and above the concrete decision in a dispute. Legal acts need to reproduce and, if possible, to increase juridical authority. And in the surplus of law, exploitation is at play. Namely, those people are exploited who are actually interested merely in the success of their concrete legal dispute, but who nevertheless have to master the extra energy that generates new resources of normativity for future use. that emerge from the dispute, and more generally, that enables the law to reproduce and even to increase its capacity to create acceptance in law and society. Most drastic is Christie's formula of law as expropriation of conflict. Law expropriates our conflicts. Law is systematically unable to understand social conflicts in their own right and to resolve them adequately. The reason is that laws formalizing violence, conceptual violence, via legal procedure and conceptualizations, expropriates conflicts from their proper context of social and moral understanding of the parties. And the new formula against this is expropriate the expropriators, give the conflict back to the people. So he means alternative dispute resolution. With this suggestive slogan, Christie expresses the widespread uneasiness about law's surplus value expansion, non-responsive, inhuman, irrational, non-empathetic. So, argument number 2, object of surplus value orientation. In the language of systems theory, the orientation of a function system, be it politics, science, economy, law, art, education, religion, towards its own surplus value means that there is constant pressure on each operation to regenerate and to augment its medium of communication, which only in the case of the economy is monetary profit beyond the actual result of production. It is the surplus of the system's own communication medium, which is power, in the case of politics, truth, reputation in science, money in the economy, normativity in law, style in art, education, selection in education, faith in religion. And this is produced via the reflexive application of operations to further operations. In this reflexive process, not only are the usual follow-up operations, one payment follows another payment, one legal decision follows another legal decisions, but at the same time, each one's own ability to operate, the ability to operate is restored or even increased. And to understand this, we have to be careful. It is not simply system maintenance that surplus is directed to, neither to strengthening all kinds of system structures of institutions, norms, programs, values, etc., but exclusively to reproduce the communication medium. There's a one-sided concentration on that which creates the capitalist hyperdynamics. And again, it is not just increasing performance according to the motto higher, further, faster. This was the critique of the Club of Rome, the limits to growth. But here we are talking about something different. Because focusing on maximizing output misses the point. Instead, focusing on each operation which needs to regenerate its own medium is required, distinguishes a rigorous systemic concept from other attempts which describe a social surplus values all kinds of byproducts of communication. Such an inflated use of surplus value would mean to use it only metaphorically and would result in a loss of its theory potential. Now, the decisive difference is whether economic action is oriented on production output or on monetary profit, whether political action concentrates on policy results or on power gains, whether scholarly activities look primarily to scientific results or to increasing reputation, whether education is geared toward specific skills or toward selection, and judicial decisions either to conflict resolution or to regenerating juridical authority. Of course, usually they come in pairs, they always come together, but the difference between them is decisive. If I speak in a somewhat different language, surplus orientation gives the system operations a formal goal, which overlays, limits, dominates, and often misdirects, falsifies, and sabotages the substantive goals of their performance. And in contrast to Max Weber's famous distinction between formal and material rationality, and in contrast to Hans Kelsen's distinction between the purity of formal law and the impurity of political influences on law, the conflict between output orientation and surplus orientation is not at all a matter of the conflict between exogenous, external, irrational forces on the purity of the system and law's internal rationality. No, no. Rather, it is an internally, endogenously created conflict that is tightly connected to the history of functional differentiation based on the emergence of specialized communication media. Moreover, if this is established as a criterion of self-regulation of systems, then the various surplus pressures become the driving dynamics of the expansion imperatives in modern capitalist societies. Now comes the argument number 3. Why communication medium? Why is it so important to increase the surplus of the system's communication medium? The answer is the special contribution of communication media consists in creating the motives, the motivational force, the motivational power for accepting a communication, overcoming outright resistance. Normal communication would be reacted to via either a no or a yes. But the pressure toward the yes, the pressure toward the acceptance, this is the work of the communication media. So what are these communication media? In the first approximation, they are nothing but a special language for different problem areas and for different professions, for lawyers, doctors, managers, technicians, scientists. No? The economic language, the political language, the technical, the legal, and so on. And their language is regenerated in the normal course of communication. But there is no special motivational pressure for its augmentation, no particular desire for a linguistic surplus. But historically, with increasing social differentiation, it has become a major problem to transfer, to convey the results of specialized communication, particularly when they contradict immediate plausibility. Even if one refines the traditional persuasion techniques of eloquence and rhetoric, they have exhausted their potential. Listen to these questions. Why should you accept highly improbable assertion of learned scholars? Why obey inconvenient commands of self-proclaimed leaders? Why listen to educators who want to teach you a lesson? Why follow norms that are not in your own interest? Why accept claims to exclusive ownership? The answer is communication media are success media in contrast to dissemination media such as orality or writing, printing, digitality, insofar as they exert an almost irresistible motivational force which makes the acceptance of a communication highly probable in cases in which rejection is likely. Inconvenient or bothersome communicative offers become successful as soon as a specialized communication medium furthers drastically the chances for their acceptance. Seduction of money for handing over goods and services, power threats for obedience to commands, theoretical or empirical proof for implausible assertions, the pressure of credits and exams for accepting learning offers, normative persuasion for legal judgments. So the overwhelming motivational power of communication media is the driving motor for the dynamics of capitalist societies, and the turbocharger is surplus value orientation. Constantly augmenting the motivational force of the specialized communication medium accelerates immensely the internal dynamics of several function systems. Values as such are not responsible for the acceleration. There are many values like health or liberty or something, but they don't have this accelerating effect. They are just rules of preference that give only direction to processes. The very acceleration occurs when pressures toward the surplus of values are created. More precisely, by applying reflexively a communication media upon itself, surplus production restores and augments the motivational power to accept communication. The primary motivation, which increases the chances for acceptance, is overlaid by a secondary motivation, which augments the primary motivation itself. When a contribution to the function of the social system is generated beyond the immediate activity and its meaning, does this count as a medial surplus value, which acts as a criterion of self-regulation, as a recursive principle of the self-legitimation of systemic operations. Argument number 4. Surplus value orientation is a non-individual anonymous matrix. To avoid misunderstanding, I should add that the motivational power of communication media is not directed toward influencing mental states of individuals. Instead, it forms binding social expectations in relation to social positions, to person, organization networks, that is, semantic construct of communication that get by with a mere assumption, with a mere supposition, almost with a fiction, not the actual realization of corresponding states of individual consciousness. These are social expectations that work with a fiction that persons, organizations are necessarily oriented toward surplus increase. So individual greed needs to be sharply distinguished from social surplus orientation. What people really motivates for their action is not the primary target of socially established surplus orientation. Communicative media form social motives and have only indirect effects on individual intra-psychic processes. There's a clear division between psychic and social processes, and each of them is accountable for the creation of meaning in its own right. This separation of communicative processes in society and psychic processes in individual consciousness is crucial for grasping the dynamics of surplus value orientation. Perhaps you remember the story of the good capitalist who is at home, a very good man, benevolent, he makes donations and is public good oriented, but whenever he enters the gates of the firm, of the factory, then the profit motive takes over and he is just exposed to it. However, the separation does not exclude an elective affinity between psychic processes and social structures, between individual greed and social surplus pressures. Rather, it brings the affinity to the fore in a relation of mutual reinforcement. After all, hedge funds fascinate and attract greedy personalities, and they help the hedge funds to grow excessively. Or lawyers are said to be authoritarian personalities. Isn't this true? So this helps for the legal surplus orientation. So communication media produce only indirectly impulses for consciousness, but when they fire constantly on the individual minds, they force the single individual in Max Weber's famous iron cage of the slavery of the future. However, what finally counts for the ubiquitous force of surplus value is its firm and permanent institutionalization in various social systems, which renders it independent from idiosyncratic individual desires. Communication media shape primarily the formation of social motives, driving social processes, and under limited conditions have an indirect effect on the individual, but they work whether or not the individual agrees with them. They work even against the will of the individuals involved. Here, in their institutionalization in society, and not in the inner motivation of individuals, lies the structural violence of the various surplus pressure understood as the will to power, the will to money, the will to law, to truth, to style, to faith, which is objectivized in social institutions as well as in communicative processes and is imposed on individual minds. Argument number 5, excessive ambivalence. We should acknowledge that the precise calibration of the many surplus pressures toward one and only one communicative medium in their specific context has been the basis for immense productive forces to be unleashed under conditions of functional differentiation. Now, this is the very center of functional differentiation, that it concentrates the energies only to one and only one, the idée directrice of for you. Driven by a one-dimensional surplus orientation, each specialized social domain has been able to realize its own rationality in exclusivity without any consideration for other rationalities. This is an almost paradoxical multiple unifunctionality of autonomous spheres, and it has enabled high productivity in each system of action. In view of such immense advantages, it is difficult to see that modern society will abandon its various surplus orientations. But not unlike the monetary profit pressure in the economy, the non-monetary surplus pressure have their ugly face. The destructive and self-destructive tendencies that Karl Marx rightly attributed to the relentless profit maximization in the economy have multiplied in the non-monetary surplus pressure of other areas of life, which are working with no less force. Their indigenous growth dynamics leads to all kinds of dysfunctionalities. Within each social system, in politics, in the economy, in law, in science and technology, ruthless surplus maximization becomes almost a collective addiction, not individual addiction. That is, the repetition and multiplication of a self-damaging social behavior despite the keen knowledge of its harmful effects. And in their external relations, the system's colonizing expansion extracts surplus value from other domains of society. Processes of global economization of other social worlds, the politicization of the society, its scientification take place even simultaneously with disastrous consequences for the ecology in the broadest sense, that is, for the natural world, for society, and for individuals. Ecology understood in this broad sense, not only nature, but also society and us. Again and again, it is both internally maximizing surplus value and externally skimming off surplus from other areas of society with which modern society commits its new modern mortal sins. To name, blame, and shame the most conspicuous examples. Adolf Hitler's and Joseph Stalin's totalitarian policies were realized in excessive increases in the surplus value of political power and in the far-reaching politicization of other social areas. The role of the totalitarian political party, which siphoned off their power surplus value. That's for politics. For science and technology, Fukushima stands for the excesses of technological surplus pressures. Dr. Mengele, who is known in South America, Dr. Mengele, who sent the results of his cruel experiments on concentration camp prisoners to the Kaiser Wilhelm Institute in Heidelberg, exemplifies the perversion of surplus pressure for scientific knowledge. This man was proud of the scientific results of his perverse experiments. Scientific knowledge freed from all moral constraints. In medicine, new pathologies arise from excessive medicalization with which wants to branch off a medical therapy surplus for each individual case of suffering. And what about law? Where are there the destructive effects of its surplus? Excessive juridification of society. To each social field, put it under the command of law, results in new injustices because the law seeks to extract the normative surplus of legal decision from the conflicts in various social systems, whether they fit and whether they suit to the logic of law or not. The temptation toward juridification of the world means that its surplus orientation is extended towards society as a whole. Instead of restricting itself to the equal, unequal judgments in conflict resolution, as opposed to the different requirements of political justice, which is distributional, or moral justice, which is a recognition justice, the law attempts with an acute fever of righteousness to realize a just society, applying the instrument of juridical justice everywhere. The slogan is, it is just to decide the problems of the world with the help of the binary code of the law. And this actually is the summum ius, summa injuria of functional differentiation. Justitialization, not only juridification as the expansion of law, but justitialization as the expansion of the juridical concept of justice, as an attempt to bring the whole of society to legal justice with disastrous. The surplus imperialism of legal rationalities parallel to economic, political, or scientific expansionism is an unidirectional growth of juridical justice which needs to be resisted politically. This imperialism of a partial surplus orientation is dangerous because, in a sense, it meets the human desire for a non-divisible justice. Although it is well known that this desire cannot be fulfilled, juridical justice as societal justice continues to offer the false premise of salvation, and both produce a dangerous mixture of unanswerable questions and hypocritical answers. Now comes my last argument, argument number 6, and it's the longest one. Constitutional counter strategies. How should constitutions deal with the excessive ambivalence of ubiquitous surplus value production? Surplus restrictions, changes to surplus distribution, collectivization of the non-monetary generation of profit, liberation from societal pressures toward surplus maximization. If it's true that the compulsion to siphon off surplus value is structurally rooted everywhere throughout society, albeit in different forms, then it is no longer sufficient to make the famous constitutional decision for or against a profit-driven economy. The question of the economic constitution, capitalism or communism or whatever. Hopes for the abolition of private property and the elimination of the monetary profit orientation are in vain. Why? The destructive tendencies of the other non-monetary surplus value maximization in other systems, especially in science, technology, law, and of course politics, would remain completely unaffected. Think of the example of the Soviet Union or China before its capitalist move. Private property had been abolished, but all the other surplus mechanisms that were ruining the country, ruining the culture, and ruining the ecology. The way constitutions deal with diverse societal surplus productions would have to be conceived more carefully than any simple prohibition strategy would do. Inspiration could come from a reformulation of Karl Polanyi. His famous double movement from the history of the economy's disembedding, its automation, and its re-embedding in society. The most fascinating elements of Karl Polanyi's theory are the three falls of fictitious commodities and what he calls non-market modes of economic integration. False commodities, which is land, labor, and money, are for Polanyi the sites where monetary surplus production runs up against the reality of collective political actors. For Polanyi, labor unions and central banks were the new collective institutions that tended to counteract the economy's disembedding. So he said this for the economy, for capitalism and profit. But now what about our thesis with the many surplus orientation? So the question then would be, can one identify equivalents to Polanyi's false commodities in those social areas which are driven by non-monetary surplus orientation? The argument would be false surplus pressures, no longer false commodities, but false surplus pressures. That would be the equivalent obstructing the public interest. Institutional imagination, Roberto Unger speaks about it, would be needed to replace them by non-surplus institutions. So, do we have examples? Yes, in politics, the great historical examples has been minorities, which had been repressed in a regime based on false pressures for power surplus. As a response, constitutional courts, so Judge Mendes, that is, non-majoritarian institutions which are relatively independent from power politics, have advanced constitutional rights for minority protection. In the future, horizontal constitutional rights, so in the private area, could play a decisive role when false surplus pressures violate the integrity of individual life or institutional dynamics in the digital world today. Think of Facebook and Google, in economic organizations, in the news media, and in other social domains. Particularly in science and in medicine, where new biotechnological developments increase surplus pressures that threaten human patients and animals' interests, non-surplus oriented institutions would counteract the combined pressures of professional reputation and of economic profit. A promising example is ICANN, the government of the internet, ICANN, which attempts to counteract the combined surplus pressure from economic, technological, and political interests. And ICANN tries to do this by transforming itself into a non-profit, but also non-state organization, which is legitimized by a stakeholder constitution. Instead of direct interventions, the external pressures could indirectly work towards a changed orientation of the various societal surplus outputs, possibly toward ecological values. This would imply the following guiding principles. Fight surplus excesses and reduce their parasitic use to the necessary minimum so that the motivational force is maintained. Do not abolish them because they have productive effects, but fight their excesses, reduce the parasitic use to a minimum. But the minimum is needed. So we should not forget with our critique of capitalism or critique of modernity that these surplus orientations, the surplus production have very, very productive effects. Second, reduce the distance of secondary goals from primary goals. Remember the formal and the material goals. That would mean move surplus closer to output because they are not carved in stone. They are flexible, one can change them. Create motives for statesmanship, or should one say stateswomanship or statespersonship. So this is the sacrifice of power interest in favor of the public interest. That's rare enough in the political game. Right? In other areas, create artificially surplus values for action in the public interest. Medical research for rare diseases. Think of corona and think what happened to the economic profit principle and the reputation principle of the scholars, right? Who in a sense inhibited the production of the good medical stuff. Economic incentives for the production of ecological good. This would in a sense instrumentalize the surplus orientation for public, in this case, ecological good. Scientific area, the research in under-researched areas where immediate reputation gains are not to be expected. Finally, facilitate the framework conditions for third sector activities and for the commons, where you have the so-called non-market institutions. In order to combat the dark side of juridification, the law would have to turn against itself. As the debate over alternatives to the legal system has rightly shown, the law is by no means particularly suited for solving disputes among people satisfactorily to all concerned. Mediation, arbitration, settlement do much more justice to the nature of conflicts, their causes, and the needs of the people at dispute. Accordingly, one could in conflicts very well do without the law and its surplus values. In short, law falsifies the realities of the conflict and produces decisions that are based on self-produced fictions. Of course, this does not apply for all conflicts, but there are sorts of conflicts that could be excluded from the law. More generally, the role of the law would be to institutionally promote a society-wide reflection on various surplus values, both their production and distribution, including the normative surplus values of law itself. Left to their own devices, systemic surplus productions will only follow their tunnel vision, which focuses them on maximizing their own function. So what is needed are external pressures from civil society, from protest movement NGOs, from politics and from law, particularly constitutional law. This should induce them to become more ecologically sensitive, to counteract their negative effects and to promote their positive effects on nature, society, and people. Counter institutions would be needed to protect the integrity of social domains of action against the expansive, indeed totalizing tendencies of surplus strategies in other social domains. Institutional guarantees would have to be effective against the motivational imperatives of highly selective communicative media, seduction through money, negative sanctions of power, binding demands of law, scientific truth claims, and technological feasibility fantasies, Counter-institutions are thus directed against the structural violence which radiates from the surplus pressure of various communicative media. These institutions would resist one-dimensional motivational imperatives and would seek to liberate the potential of collective political judgment from these restrictions. Thank you very much for your attention.
Bom, em nome de todos os alunos da nossa comunidade acadêmica, gostaríamos inicialmente de agradecer muitíssimo ao professor Gunther Teubner por essa belíssima exposição sobre as constituições, a Constituição das mais-valias não econômicas. Como nós falamos no início do nosso encontro, o texto do professor Teubner, que subsidiou esta apresentação, ele foi escrito originalmente para um simpósio online do Verfassungsblog, que é um blog muito importante na Alemanha de difusão das obras do direito constitucional. E esse texto foi por nós traduzido e publicado, inclusive, em língua portuguesa, hoje no portal J. Portanto, aos que desejarem consultar o texto e aprofundar um pouco das suas lições, o texto foi um resumo, na realidade, do artigo do professor Teubner, foi disponibilizado hoje no portal J. Nós, a partir de agora, iremos abrir para debate e estamos recebendo algumas perguntas, tanto pelo YouTube quanto aqui pelo Zoom. Neste momento, e acho que seria uma informação importante, nós estamos com cerca de 270 participantes online nos acompanhando, tanto aqui pela plataforma do Zoom quanto pelo YouTube. Temos algumas perguntas que, se o professor Teubner nos permitir, iremos dirigir a ele. A primeira pergunta é da participante Alessandra, e ela indaga o seguinte: a internalização do conceito de desenvolvimento sustentável como um direito humano por parte da sociedade poderia ser considerado um efeito positivo da mais-valia ou talvez uma contra-estratégia à mais-valia?
Yeah, I think this is a very good argument and a very good example for institutional imagination. I mean, we think of human rights in the very narrow sense, what we thought about human rights in the very narrow sense of human rights against government. And today we experience the expansion of human rights in several directions. I was mentioning the expansion into the private sphere, which already has to do with your argument. So human rights in the direction of sustainable developments, I think, are a possible quasi-Karl Polanyi institution of counteracting surplus pressures. Yeah, and this is interesting. Not only within politics or within the economy, but even within science and technology. So this construction of rights, of human rights in this sense, covers or is directed against all kinds of driving dynamics in society. And I think it is also, this kind of construction of human rights would not abolish the dynamism. Rather, it would limit it, like constitutional rights are limiting the power of the state. So it would limit the ecology damaging actions of different social systems. And perhaps, and this is then perhaps the more interesting idea, if one thinks not only these rights in terms of negative rights, of limiting certain damaging tendencies of ecological aggression, should I say, but rather, if you think also of the development of human rights into the area of participatory rights or of social rights, then you would see the positive the positive side of these rights in terms of, in a sense, redirecting social dynamics of surplus orientation, social dynamics in the direction of the furtherance of ecological goods. Okay.
Muito obrigado, professor. Obrigado pela sua resposta. Dando continuidade aos nossos debates, temos mais alguns questionamentos de alguns participantes. A Marília Sampaio gostaria de direcionar ao senhor a seguinte pergunta. Apesar de não serem individuais, as pressões para a produção de mais-valia em qualquer sistema, mas no direito especial, e sim institucionais, poderíamos considerar que decisões judiciais marcadas por aquilo que se chama de um ativismo judicial, ou seja, decisões voltadas exclusivamente para o ganho discursivo de normatividade, como um fruto bem-sucedido, porém destrutivo, das pressões por mais-valia nos nossos dias? Ou seja, essas decisões judiciais ativistas poderiam ser consideradas pressões por mais-valia?
Well, I think the answer should be that we distinguish. I wouldn't accept this in broad lines. Let me first talk to what you said about individual. I mean, this is a somewhat tricky thing. On the one side, the surplus pressures are not primarily directed at our individual minds, at our inner life, our consciousness and all that, right? So they are social constructs, they're social expectations. So this is, which in a sense, structure social communications and not the minds and thought of people. But there is one thing which is so important and which also leads to misunderstanding. The surplus pressures are not oriented toward the systems as a whole. For example, in the economy, it is not creating more and more and more and more money, right? Rather, it is directed toward individual social positions, not minds, individual social positions and organizations to augment the money, to make profit, or in more general language, to create the motivation, or to maintain and create the motivational force of their actions. This is very important to see that this is that like subjective rights and the money is a system, a device, but it's not directed to the system as a whole. Rather, it is directed toward individual positions. So the same is with the surplus orientation. Now, judicial activism, I would not say that with this concept, I'm criticizing judicial activism because it is always oriented toward the surplus. No, not at all. A very formal application of law as well as a quasi-political judicial activism, they both have to grapple with the questions how to increase the surplus value of law, that is the persuasive force of law, right? And there's no difference. This kind of excessive ambition on the part of the judges can be with formal application of law as well as with judicial activism. Let me give you an example or two of the German tradition. there was the question of incest. Should incest between siblings, so between brother and sister, be punished? And this went up to the court. And this was now a question for one of the judges who advocated for judicial activism. He said, we have to abolish this punishment of incest between siblings. And he made beautiful arguments. He took together all the sociological, psychological, medical, anthropological knowledge and showed that it makes no rational sense to punish brothers and sisters for having an incestuous relation. But the funny thing was that all the colleagues in the constitutional courts said flatly, no, we don't. To punish incest makes good sense. This was their only argument. And why that? You know what was behind it? Of course, behind it was the surplus principle of law. You know, if the judges would dare to touch on such a deep-seated taboo of the incest, they would lose their motivational force to such a degree that they just were restraining from this position. So you see, it is not judicial activism as such which creates more surplus orientation, while it may be very formal orientation of law which does the same thing.
Obrigado mais uma vez, professor. Vamos dar continuidade às perguntas. Nós recebemos gentilmente uma pergunta enviada pelo professor Tássio Lacerda, da PUC de São Paulo, a quem, inclusive, eu gostaria de agradecer pelo questionamento que nos foi enviado. E ele faz a seguinte pergunta. Prezado professor Teubner, é um prazer ouvir a sua palestra. E ele faz a seguinte indagação. A ideia de mais-valia não econômica, na forma proposta no texto do senhor, é claramente aderente, né, ao tempo do mundo em que nós estamos vivendo, especialmente no Brasil. A pressão por uma mais-valia política tem um lado negro, que ainda será quantificado nas vidas que nós perdemos em razão da pandemia da Covid-19. E aí o professor Tássio fala, eu não tenho dúvida de que a sua proposta se aplica inteiramente para a nossa sociedade. E ele tem duas questões. O senhor imagina alguma restrição na aplicação dessas ideias em um país com um grau diferente de desenvolvimento em relação aos países da Europa continental? Se sim, qual seria as restrições dessa aplicação? E existe alguma forma de quantificar o valor jurídico que é adicionado e o que, analogamente ao que pode ser feito com o valor econômico que é colocado dentro dessa noção de mais-valia?
Well, thank you very much for these very complex questions. I will try my best to answer it. I mean, you are quite right in looking at the role of politics in the corona affair. I mean, let's take Trump as our example. I think it is almost shamelessly how Trump is pushing for his power gains by speaking publicly about public health, the public good, the good of society, economic relief and all that, while at the same time we can see he's just relying and just striving for the own profit of power maximization. The clearest example what we have, And here the hypocrisy is so strong, and he is far away from any idea of statesmanship, which would mean to restrict the power greed and to try to further the public interest. But I mean, we should not be unjust. It is not only politics that plays a bad game here. I mean, let's think of economic action. The farmer groups, how they shamelessly exploit the very situation in order to monopolize their profits, to create patents, and how difficult it is to come with, you know, public interest measures in order to have a kind of equal distribution of possible medication in this area. And we should not forget that also our scientists, so us, play their reputation game here, sometimes shamelessly, sometimes in a positive way, when they try to position themselves in a very public position without knowing anything or without knowing little, or via manipulating research results for the sake of creating their own reputation. So you see, it is everywhere. It's everywhere, and of course, at the moment, the role of politics probably is the worst. I'm not sure about what you call then underdeveloped cultures or questions. I mean, I even would not accept the concept of under. Rather, we should talk of different societies. I mean, it's very difficult. I mean, if I speak of indigenous societies as the extreme case, I mean, there you do not have the separation of those different function system and of different surplus orientations. So religion, in a sense, plays a super dominant role because it creates the cosmology of the whole indigenous world, and it at the same time is inseparably united with political, economic, aesthetic, scientific measures. So there is a whole unity of how shall I say, of surplus orientation and faith. Religious faith has its great chance in such a situation, which we, for example, see also in the Islamic countries. While in modernity, religion has very great difficulties in developing its surplus orientation, because I don't know, where is the communicative success of messages of faith? At least it has been reduced to something. Quantification, I don't know. No, yes, it's an important issue. And here we see that things are not equal everywhere. And this whole exercise of using surplus value is the tatium comparationis in order to look at different social systems does not mean, and this is important, to equalize them, to say, oh, this is everywhere and it works everywhere the same thing. No, rather, it is a problem of a comparative analysis to use the criterion or the tatium comparationis of surplus value, and then to find out what do they have in common, where are the differences. And the differences are especially in formalization and quantification, what you were pointing to. I mean, the high visibility of the economy has to do with the formalization of the money value, the formalization of surplus. Everything comes down to the bottom line, and every item in our society can be given a price tag. So this makes a huge possibility of quantification, which is not possible everywhere. For example, in politics, we have some quantification. If you think of votes, and if you think of elections and voting procedures, and if you think of polling, opinion polls, there you have all this kind of economic-like ranking of the prestige of politicians, but the important informal power shifts in the day-to-day politics and in long-term political developments, they are not quantifiable. So there it needs judgment and taste and a good feeling for what the power gains are. And in law, it is also very, very difficult. And this has to do with the relation between the medium of legal normativity and its different forms. Because where is the persuasive power of the judges? It's not just their arguments, as fine as they are. No, it is first of all the sanctions behind a judgment. Right? This creates a big persuasive power of the law. And then it is the hierarchy of the courts, the persuasive authority of higher positions. And it has to do with the persuasive power of one judgment, if it really resolves the conflict or no, if it's just a formal judgment which doesn't help the people. And then, of course, also the reasoning plays a role for the persuasive power of the communication medium of law. So the quality of reasoning internally, is it dogmatically sound, what the judges are producing, and externally, is it plausible and convincing what they preach as a result to a conflict? So there's not very much to be quantified, and it is the advantage, or if you want, the disadvantage of economic life, that this huge kind of quantification is possible. In education and in science, again, you have a mixed picture. Reputation today is quantified. If you think of all this quotation indexes and what we all have when we apply for an academic position, where reputation in a sense is really quantified into little bits and pieces. And in education, you have the formalization and quantification via grades, exams, ranking orders, prizes, and all that. So partially they are quantifiable, and this will go on in science and in education, I'm sure. In law, I'm less sure. Of course, there are some possibilities. So, I mean, I'm not sure whether quantification is a benign or a bad thing, because on the one side it helps for orientation and all that, and the other time it moves the surplus orientation further away from so-called material goals, substantive goals.
Muito obrigado novamente, professor. Dando continuidade aqui às nossas perguntas, nós temos uma pergunta que foi nos enviada pelo professor Fernando Richter, do Mackenzie, de São Paulo. Também gostaria de agradecer ao professor Fernando Richter pelo envio da pergunta. E ele gostaria de perguntar sobre um assunto muito importante que é trabalhado na obra do professor Teubner, que é a fragmentação do direito, ou esse conceito de fragmentação das constituições, né? Fragmentação do direito. E ele faz o seguinte questionamento. Redes supranacionais com grande efetividade criam os seus próprios instrumentos de resolução de disputas que podem, eventualmente, violar alguns direitos humanos. Um país de desenvolvimento, ou um país não tão desenvolvido como o Brasil, teria alguma maneira de lutar efetivamente contra esses tipos de violações que são perpetradas nessas redes supranacionais?
Yeah, thank you for this important question. Yeah, I think fragmentation is the important issue in our world, which is in a sense the mirroring of functional differentiation of society. That then within the law, we have lost the famous unity of the legal order, and the legal order is now fragmented into different areas, jurisdictions, and also constitutions. And this is then the issue of the societal constitutionalism that reacts in a sense to the surplus orientation I'm talking about. So it's not just a unified constitution that reacts to them. Rather, it is either the political constitution, which reacts to the political surplus, the economic constitution to economic things, the science constitution, and so on. And they all play a similar role. At the one side, they help to constitute the communication media of different fields. For example, money is not only a creation of spontaneous economic processes, not at all. There's a lot of law and constitution in the creation of money as the communication medium of the economy. And we should not forget that this is not just an evolutionary process, rather there are political decisions and legal decisions involved that create the institutional fact of money. Right? But at the same time, and the same is true for science and for other constitutions, and of course in the political constitution we have this. The whole power relations are not just a development of evolutionary forces of opposing interests, rather they are the result of constitutional design that first makes political power possible as a means of transmitting decisions, and making political power independent from, let's say, or relatively independent from wealth or military force, and so rather via creating artificially the power positions in democratic procedures. So this is the constitutive roles of different societal constitutions, while when we then that are also creating the possibility of surplus orientation. But then when we talk about the dark side of surplus orientation, then the constitutions are under pressure to create limitations to them, which we see in the political sphere with the constitutional courts and human rights. But we also have to have this in economic constitution and in other as well. So this is something which has been achieved to a certain degree in certain countries as a kind of, we really could call this as a cultural achievement, the development of political constitution and other constitutions to deal with the surplus orientation in a positive way and at the same time in a limiting way. And today, the new task after all this transnationalization and globalization processes is to have a look with the constitutional optics to the what you call the new developed transnational networks. And here we are really at the very beginning of everything. We can see that the WTO, which has become weak today, has developed something like an own constitution and is also limiting its own actions. So if you think of the idea that free trade is, the idée directrice of the WTO, but at the same time they accept limitation of the free trade principle via ecological or health concerns. So this is what I would call a constitutional limitation of the of the surplus value orientation in this area. And we have the European Union, where similar processes take place and where the establishment of of constitutional rights is an achievement, but this is rather unequally distributed over the globe, and I think there's still a long way to go to introduce that. And of course, this is also a question of, power, of the different power plays in different countries. So we cannot just say, oh, we should develop the institutional ideas and then implement it. It is always a question of external pressures that come from politics, but that come also from civil society and social movements, and from the law on those different networks to begin to develop self-limitations of their destructive tendencies.
Muito obrigado, professor Teubner. Nós estamos com várias outras perguntas, vou tentar resumi-las, mas antes também, de forma um pouco, até um pouco deselegante, eu queria aproveitar para eu também fazer uma pergunta ao senhor sobre um assunto que já discutimos bastante no Brasil e que tem se tornado muito importante aqui no Brasil. Mas uma das contra-estratégias que o senhor destacou na apresentação, para tentar conter, né, a noção de mais-valia, consistiria no reforço da teoria da eficácia horizontal dos direitos fundamentais. Aqui no Brasil, professor, nós, tanto do ponto de vista doutrinário, quanto também do ponto de vista jurisprudencial, a noção que a gente tem de eficácia horizontal dos direitos fundamentais ainda é muito limitada à ideia de direitos de defesa, né, de abfair, né? E a gente tem ainda pouca maturidade para lidar com essa teoria dentro de uma perspectiva de institucionalização social que o senhor, inclusive em outros textos, defende. E eu gostaria de perguntar para o senhor como é que é essa perspectiva de institucionalização social da eficácia horizontal dos direitos fundamentais, como é que o senhor acha que isso pode servir para lidar com um problema que é um problema mundial, né, mas que hoje é muito latente no Brasil, que é o debate sobre a responsabilidade de intermediários online, de redes sociais, pelos conteúdos de terceiros, né? A gente sabe que na Alemanha foi adotada uma lei em 2017 que coloca um regime muito detalhado de responsabilidade a esses agentes, como Twitter, Facebook, etc. Aqui no Brasil, o tema muito provavelmente vai ser enfrentado pelo Supremo Tribunal Federal, já que existe uma ação que discute esse assunto e que será apreciada pelo tribunal em algum momento. Como o senhor acha que essa perspectiva de eficácia horizontal, dentro dessa noção de institucionalização social e não apenas de direito de defesa, pode contribuir para essa discussão?
Yeah, thank you. This is a very important question, when I think about horizontal effects of human rights, of course, this is in the first instant related to defense rights, negative rights, to create legal defenses against the encroachments on the integrity of individual life and on the integrity of social institutions. I think this is and remains an important part of it. And yeah, I think constitutional law in the political sphere has developed a lot of doctrines and ideas which need to be transferred to the private area, especially to the relations to the powerful corporations and so on. Yeah, but secondly, the participatory or social dimension of human rights, which played a big role in the political area with the development of the welfare state. What could it have? What meaning could it have in the private area? And of course, the great historical example for this is labor law and co-determination, workers' participation in firms, which is no, really, in a sense, a counter institution to economic rationality. It introduces a political participatory element in rational economic decision making, and you can really see how something like workers' participation has an effect on redirecting the economic profit principle in its distributional effects in the relation between shareholders, management, and workers. So there we have, I think, a very good example of the participatory dimension of human rights, as well as on its effects on the profit orientation of the economy. Another example would be something like corporate social responsibility, all those different initiatives coming from the middle of society, from protest movement, from consumer movements, and in a sense to compel the corporations to realize positive functions, positive social aspects of economic rationalities, to introduce into the hierarchy of economic goals something like ecological orientation, human rights orientation, social orientation. This is something, yeah, I would say revolutionary, although it's still underdeveloped. Now, you bring a third thing, the online world, and the possibilities to counteract the many externalities that those new online institutions have on third parties. Of course, here, as you said, the role of the state courts is very important. And one can see that they, in my view, they are one of the main pressures that are exerted upon the internal constitutions of Facebook, Google, and company now to do what? To create internal limiting structures, damaging effects of the activities, because this cannot be realistic via state institutions, be it the courts, be it the regulatory agencies. What these institutions can do is to create this strong external pressures on development of internal, even digital structures, digital structure, not only legal norms within the intermediaries, but that they begin to constitutionalize, that is, to create themselves limiting effects on their tendencies that are again then controlled by the external forces. And you see, something at the moment is going on, and I'm referring to Facebook reacting to this massive protest from the community world to create internal court structures. And they are now realizing and discussing, but also institutionalizing an internal court of their own that supervises the action of the many internal regulatory agency. And there are thousands of them. So we should not think this is just a little bit. There are thousands of them, and they, in a sense, need an internal structure, as other regimes have also developed, like the WTO, for example. They have not only their panels, but then they have the supervisory panel, which is at the moment obstructed by our friend Trump again. So this is what Facebook is creating at the moment, not out of voluntary action and love for the law and love for conflict resolution, but as a result of the external pressures that come from the internet community and from the political and legal world. So I think this is the future. This is the future, a kind of, if you want, co-regulation of external pressures from courts, from the regulatory agency, plus the internal structures that respond to that. And out of this interaction, I think certain limitations of these damages could be the result.
Perfeito, professor. Muito obrigado. Agradeço pessoalmente muito pela sua resposta. Nosso tempo está ficando um pouco apertado, estamos chegando ao final, portanto, eu vou escolher mais duas perguntas e passaria elas ao senhor em bloco. Uma pergunta é do nosso participante André Galvão, que nos fala diretamente de Recife, Pernambuco, Nordeste brasileiro. E ele pergunta, professor Teubner, o conceito paradoxal da justiça como uma fórmula de contingência do sistema jurídico pode ser útil para a observação da pressão por mais-valia? Essa é a pergunta do André Galvão. E outra pergunta de um participante é a seguinte: as formas intermediárias desempenham, juntamente com a constitucionalização própria de cada sistema, a estratégia de proteger a sociedade do dilema weberiano. Não haveria, no entanto, o risco de produzir uma mais-valia, um surplus mais perigoso do próprio direito ao atribuir funções mais amplas de coordenação social? A pergunta foi feita pelo Cristiano Maia, de Brasília.
All right, these are very thoughtful questions, and I will try my best to answer it. Yeah, I mean, there's a relation, a strong relation between concerns of justice, understood as a contingency formula, and surplus orientation. So I think when you speak of the contingency formula, yes, you do not only mean that justice can be different, but you think that justice is dependent upon outside demands from different fields of society. And there, I think the surplus value comes in. So the experience of people, not only of the bright side of the surplus orientations. And I mean, again, I would like to stress this. We should not only think of the dark side, like Foucault only speaks of the dark side of power and just forgets the bright side. I mean, if we want to understand the dynamics of modern society, and if we want to understand why everything is accelerating, but at the same time, why very productive and positive use of social energies has been produced by our society, then we see also the bright side of the surplus orientations. And then we have to speak about the justice issue, namely, in a sense, to counteract their negative and damaging effects on nature, people, and society. Here, in a sense, the suffering of the people from certain results of the economic profit principle, or from certain results of a technology running amok, like the nuclear energy, or from certain progress of medical techniques, which are just idiotic, then we can see what it means that justice is contingent upon the demands from society, from the suffering of people, and this then has to be translated into legal issues and then formulated in legal terms and legal decisions. And of course, we should also not forget the transcendence dimension of justice, which would mean that in these issues, the law comes to the limits of its own meaning and has to overcome them, has to transcends itself. Now, when you speak about the collegial formations and the possibility of creating here another surplus orientation with negative connotations, I say I would agree. It is a very strange game of, shall we say, balancing different profit strategies and surplus strategies, because of course also a collegial formation will find its own surplus orientation. And if one tries to activate the law again, then we have the problems which I had called in my lecture the justicialization and the juridification of the world. So in a sense, you are fighting devil by Beelzebub. No doubt about this. No doubt about this. And also, when I spoke in the Karl Polanyi sense of false commodities and now false surplus orientations, so when we really feel that in a certain area it is wrong to apply the economic profit principle, or it is wrong to apply the scientific reputation principle, if we replace them then by public good institutions, of course we run again then in problems of political power and its orientations. So we are never out of the game, but you know, this different counteracting is an important issue, which, you know, if done with wisdom and a bit of luck, can lead to positive results. But there is no guarantee that, how shall I say, that we find a final paradise-like resolution of the problematic of surplus orientation.
Obrigado, professor. Obrigado por toda a sua dedicação em responder com muita profundidade as nossas perguntas, as perguntas dos nossos participantes. Estamos, infelizmente, chegando ao fim. Gostaria de dizer aqui, em nome dos alunos, que foi um prazer imenso tê-lo aqui. E eu gostaria de passar a palavra ao menino Gilmar Mendes para o encerramento deste evento.
Professor, muito obrigado. Boa tarde aí em Frankfurt. Nós queremos, de fato, agradecer muitíssimo por sua participação, pela disponibilidade desse tempo para todos os brasileiros que tiveram interesse em participar e puderam acompanhar a sua brilhante palestra. E esperamos, ainda este ano, poder tê-lo entre nós aqui presencialmente, para que possamos fazer o lançamento de sua obra. Muito obrigado por tudo. Muito obrigado.
Thank you. It was a great honor for me and a pleasure to hear all these challenging questions and arguments and implied criticism, and I will think about more in the future.
Vielen Dank. Thank you very much.